Hi, friends. My name is Mako Nagasawa. I'm the director of the Anástasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry. And I thought we'd do something fun in this video series, which would be to explore the theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And Amazon has put out a Rings of Power series, and I'm not going to comment on that. Because I'm not sure if I haven't watched it yet, but it's been out a few weeks. But I am taking the opportunity to just refresh myself on the source material that Tolkien had, where it came from, what he was up to, and just enjoy it. And so this series of videos will be short, and in terms of like maybe 10-15 minutes each, and I will try to comment here and there on the source material, and I hope you will join me in appreciating it and reading parts of The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, or other things that Christopher Tolkien, the son of J.R.R. Tolkien, has put out since then. So broadly speaking, as an outline, I'm going to try to follow this. I'm going to do an introduction to J.R.R. Tolkien. I will then talk about theodicy, the problem of how do we understand if there's a good God, if there is evil in the world. And then I'll talk about identity, the role of humanity in Tolkien's stories, salvation, the defeat of evil. Number 5, ethics, what is the right thing to do? And number 6, epistemology, how do we know? Okay, let's jump into Tolkien here. So here's a very brief biography and what I think Tolkien's purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Hobbit were. So John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born January 3rd, 1892. He died at September 2nd, 1973. He was a Roman Catholic from the age of 8 and loved to invent languages. So when he was a young boy, he invented Animalic, and then Nevbosh, and then Nafaran, and that became his preoccupation. He loved languages, and he developed Elvish, and connected it to actual languages like Norse languages, Eastern European languages like Estonian, and another thing that influenced him that we'll come back to is that he was a participant, a soldier in World War I. He was involved in the trench warfare in France, and that made a big impact on him. Here's a fun little thing from Humphrey Carpenter in his biography of Tolkien, just how in love he was with his wife, Edith. So when they were dating and courting, this happens. Edith and Ronald took to frequenting Birmingham tea shops, especially one which had a balcony overlooking the pavement. There they would sit and throw sugar lumps into the hats of passers-by, moving to the next table when the sugar bowl was empty. With two of their personalities and in their position, with two people of their personalities and in their position, romance was bound to flourish. Both were orphans in need of affection, and they found that they could give it to each other. During the summer of 1909, they decided that they were in love. Very charming story, and Tolkien dedicated much of his writing to Edith and their children. And in fact, on their tombstone, he had written Beren and Luthien, who were a couple in the Silmarillion that was very significant. So he was a devoted husband and father. He became professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford from 1925 to 1945. He became a professor of English language and literature for another 14 years, 1945 to 59, and was now called the father of modern fantasy literature because of his work on Middle-earth, this world that he created in the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings. After Peter Jackson turned the Lord of the Rings into a trilogy of movies, he was called the author of the century. Sales in his book were resurgent, but but he was already very influential in literature. So what was he doing in writing Lord of the Rings and kind of the backstory of that? Well, I think it's helpful to think of three purposes. Number one, he was writing a story that anchors words. Remember, his first love was actually for language, or what was called philology, the science of language and literature. So in many ways, he developed Elvish and different Elvish languages based on actual human languages, and there's an interesting connection there. And secondly, and then he wrote a story in which to put the languages. Secondly, he was writing a myth for England. So he was clear about that, that this somehow related to a pre-Christian myth of the Anglo people. So the earliest Anglo literature that we have is Beowulf. It's a massive poem, and it's already got Christian influence in it. So he was interested in what was the literature of the Anglos, what were the myth of the Angles before Beowulf, before Christian faith arrived. And then thirdly, he was writing a Hebrew Bible for pre-Christian England. So he was engaging in a work of missiology, which is this kind of the study of Christian missionary work. How do Christians interpret culture and language and so on? So let's look at the first one, a story that anchors words. So the thing that Tolkien loved to point out was there are words, for example, the word for dwarf is very similar across multiple languages, especially in Northern Europe. And so dvarg, dverger, tverg, and dvergs and are very similar, and they all refer to a short bearded man. And the question Tolkien was trying to answer is, well, why is that? It must be because there's a story about what we now know as dwarfs, short bearded men. Well, what was the first story? How did these stories develop? How consistent were they, and so on? And so Tolkien noticed that because the languages were very old, that there must have been an older story behind the languages. As a reflection of that, he used spellings of words that were very old. So I think when he first published The Hobbit, the editor translated the first edition of The Hobbit of Gandalf as with a PH, and that was not the way Tolkien spelled Gandalf. Tolkien spelled Gandalf with an F, and so he wrote an angry letter to the editor saying, you just messed everything up, because everybody knows the PH spelling entered English only at like the 13th or 14th century or whatever that was, and everybody knows, right? So he was definitely trying to place his story in connection with how he knew languages developed, especially English. And so, he had developed different Elvish languages, and he was putting those languages into the story. Secondly, Tolkien was writing a myth for England. So again, I mentioned that the earliest Anglo-Saxon literature is Beowulf. It's already influenced by Christianity. What would a pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon literature have been like? And then, here's an example of why this is fun. This is a scene from Fellowship of the Ring when Bilbo gives the sword Sting to Frodo. Now, in the movie, he just hands over the sword, but in the book, it says this: he took from the box a small sword in an old, shabby leathern scabbard. Then he drew it, and its polished and well-tended blade glittered suddenly, cold and bright. "This is Sting," he said, and thrust it with little effort deep into a wooden beam. "Take it if you like. I shan't want it again, I expect." Frodo accepted it gratefully. So you understand the scene. Bilbo, Frodo's uncle, takes Sting and thrusts it into a wooden beam like this. how does Frodo draw it out? Most likely he wrapped his hand around it and drew it out. Well, what's that like? That is like the stories of King Arthur, isn't it? So drawing a sword from a stone. So this is what it means that Tolkien was writing a myth for England. Of course, Tolkien knows like all of the literature of the Anglo-Saxons, but he is trying to create a story that had resonance and archetypes and themes and motifs that came before. All right, so the third purpose Tolkien wrote for was to try to construct a Hebrew Bible for a pre-Christian world. The reason for this is because Augustine of Canterbury was basically the missionary to the Christian missionary to the Angles, and he in 597 we have a record of him preaching to King Ethelbert and his queen. They were the leaders of the Angles, and they became Christians according to what history we have. And apparently the entire people of the Angles became Christians in relatively short order. And it is a bit of a question of how did that happen? So what Tolkien is imagining is that there was some kind of engagement between the Christian story and an older story that was held by the Old English people. And there was so much resonance in the hearts of the people that they said, oh, okay, yes, the Christian story makes sense. We will believe in Jesus. Now, there is a lot of evidence for this. And so Joseph Pearce writes in an article, Tolkien insisted that the fact that he was, quote, a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic, end quote, was the most important and really significant element in his work. So he didn't think that he was writing, he didn't want to write an allegory per se. He thought he was writing a parallel story, or even a history of, or a history that of the actual earth that the Bible left some room for. Like there were gaps in the storytelling. And so Tolkien thought, okay, these are the places where I could fill in some history. And so the question becomes, what allusions or patterns would a Christian missionary have worked with if that was the case? So let's take one of the more simple examples, March 25th. That was the day of, the ring fell into the fire. So it marked a day of self-sacrifice, in essence, where Frodo almost succeeded, but failed in throwing the ring into the fire. In Return of the King, chapter 4, Tolkien says this, but in Gondor, the new year will always now begin upon the 25th of March, when Sauron fell, and when you were brought out of the fire to the king. The 25th of March, in Anglo-Saxon belief and in European popular tradition, both before and after that, is the date of the crucifixion. So why would Tolkien line those things up? And you might know that as in my work at the Anástasis Center, we're very interested in early Christian thought and how the parallels between Jesus and Frodo are kind of worked out. So did Jesus take on a struggle as he struggled with his own humanity because it was wrestling with him, but he defeated it at the cross? So in a way that Frodo could have, but didn't, defeat the ring. Well, we'll be exploring that. It's so fascinating. Here's another parallel. So the resurrected Gandalf parallels the resurrected Jesus. So in the Two Towers, Gandalf comes back to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in the Fangorn forest. And it says this, at last Aragorn stirred, Gandalf, he said, beyond all hope you return to us in our need. What veil was over my sight? Gandalf. It's fascinating that Tolkien says, what veil was over my sight for Aragorn. There's something that was preventing Aragorn from seeing Gandalf. That same thing happens in Luke chapter 24 when Jesus is with two of his disciples on the Emmaus Road. In verse 15, while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. So, and then Jesus continues on, he retells the story of the scriptures and then breaks bread with them. And then their eyes were opened and they recognized him and he vanished from their sight. That is fascinating. On its own, the story is really cool. Their eyes were opened is a direct lift from Genesis 3, where their eyes were opened, but their sight fell on themselves. Adam and Eve's focus fell on themselves. Here, their eyes were opened, but they behold Jesus and they focus on him. And it is a reversal of the story of the fall. In the fall, you have two people, a couple walking with God. They eat something they should not. Their eyes were opened and they lose their dominion. They lose their ability to proclaim a lordship from Eden outward. With Jesus, there's two people, probably Cleopas and his wife. We know it's Cleopas, the second disciple is unnamed. So it's very open to him being walking there with his wife. And they walk with God, but they don't know it. In the context of a meal, they eat something that they're told to. Their eyes were opened and they focus on him. And they are restored to proclaiming a lordship over the creation from Jerusalem, which is kind of a new Eden outward. And there's just all kinds of imagery and things that are consistent there with what Luke is doing. But Tolkien writes a story where he is drawing together closely, but not overtly, the resurrection of Gandalf and the resurrection of Jesus. And Gandalf here says, I come to you now at the turning of the tide. Christian thought has seen the resurrection of Jesus as the turning of the tide. So clear parallel. Another is Aragorn and Jesus. So Aragorn is the king, the kingly figure. And when he is crowned at the climax of Return of the King, Tolkien says this, but when Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood, and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, behold the king. So it's a beautiful passage on its own. This is how the enthronement of Jesus is portrayed in the Old Testament as a prophetic vision, where the prophet Daniel says this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. So in there, the phrase Ancient of Days seems to refer to God the Father. The kingly figure is crowned or coronated as the Son of Man, one like a son of man, and to that one was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. So these scenes are similar. They're, again, not exact copies of one another, and Tolkien is very averse to doing that, but there are interesting connections, right? The phrase Ancient of Days is used in different ways, but it's not overt. It's subtle, but it makes us think of biblical connections. The idea is that the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament is what Christians call it, had different offices or roles: the prophet, priest, and king. And each of those roles that people filled over the centuries was part of the job description Jesus would eventually take on and fulfill. Like, everyone tried, and they had success. They were faithful to different degrees, but Jesus was the one who was faithful 100%. What Tolkien seems to be doing is saying, if you take Gandalf, Frodo, and Aragorn, and we would probably have to include Sam along with Frodo, you see the same types of roles. Gandalf is like the prophet. He's the truth sayer. He's one who can has insight into the future, and so he's like a prophet. And certainly in his role as truth speaker and challenger, he plays that role. Frodo and Sam are the burden bearers, like the priests in the Old Testament. They bear a burden that no one else does, in this case, bearing the ring. And then Aragorn plays the role of the king. And those seem to connect to Jesus in their own ways, and it's really fun and fascinating. So again, what was Tolkien's purpose in writing Lord of the Rings and all of the backstory to that? Number one, to write a story that anchors words. Number two, to write a myth for England. And number three, to at least speculate a little bit that there was a Hebrew Bible equivalent for pre-Christian England. So that raises the question, what is the theology of Tolkien, and how do we see that in Lord of the Rings and maybe the Silmarillion too? So again, I think if you join us for this little journey here, I think you'll have a lot of fun. I'm going to have a lot of fun with this, just rereading Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. And if you would like more in-depth kind of thoughts, reflection, and analysis of the stories themselves, you'll find a lot of that already on YouTube. I've enjoyed almost everything that I've seen on that. And I think what will be unique and different about this time together is that we'll look especially from the standpoint of Christian theology. What is Tolkien doing with Christian theology? And what do we learn from it? How might we live in hope and courage and love and faithfulness because of it? So thanks for joining us. Looking forward to the next time.